Tomorrow is Martin Luther King's birthday, and it seems very timely to be reminded of the lessons that he taught us. And so, in his 1958 book, Stride Towards Freedom, the Montgomery story, Martin Luther King wrote, "The nonviolent resistor not only refuses to shoot his opponent, but he also refuses to hate him." And if you can understand and feel, even in the midst of those critical and often physically painful moments, that your attacker is as much a victim as you are, that he is a victim of the forces that have shaped and fed his anger and fury, then you are well on your way to the nonviolent life. And that quote is from John Lewis. Martin Luther King's theology of nonviolent social change was, and still is, to seek truth and love while refusing, through nonviolent resistance, to participate in something you believe is wrong. Last week, life came at us pretty fast, and as I chew over the unprecedented events, I reflect on experiences of my life that changed me. And I also continue to reflect on the words and actions of Martin Luther King, John Lewis, and Jesus, the powerful words that changed us all. But let me begin with a reflection about recounting of my first act of nonviolent protest. I, a white, lower middle class, smart girl in the 8th grade in an average lower middle class suburban junior high school, Jefferson Junior High, was a rule follower. That April, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. I had always been part of the quirky group of kids at school, a small group of about 10 of us that didn't really fit in anywhere with the other groups, the socials or greasers or blacks. Our group was a mixed bag of black, brown, and white girls, one with hearing aids. All of us poor, at least according to the standards set by the other groups in our school. When my little group gathered on that Friday morning for our usual pre-first class conversation, we talked about MLK's death and decided to tie black fabric to our arms. We must have pinched it from the home ec class. I don't really remember. There was an assembly that day, which was called and meant to ease the tensions of the different groups of kids at the school who found little to no excuse to start fights. This was in the 70s, and there were always fights between groups. Several other groups were wearing armbands. At lunchtime, an announcement came over the loudspeaker that anyone wearing an armband would be suspended. Well, my little group decided that was not something that they could tell us to do. Although it made me a little nervous, I remember being very excited that I felt I was making a statement by disobeying. So we kept on our black armbands. The middle of the afternoon, another announcement came over the loudspeaker that anyone who wore a black armband to school on Monday would be suspended. So far, nobody had been suspended. So my little group decided that we would show up with the armbands on Monday and Tuesday with nary a word from the powers that be. By Friday, the armbands were a thing of the past. Sometimes it is good to be the invisible group. But that was my first step into countering the authorities, civil disobedience. Now, I must say, I was and am a pretty boring person who believes in the essence of the law And this little story doesn't seem like much to you listeners, I can imagine, but it changed my life. I was able to do something about what I believed was the right thing to do, not just the action of wearing an armband, but an action, something I stood for. From the time I was a very small girl, my grandfather would come to our house on Fridays for dinner. He was part American Indian, as was my grandmother. The experiences he had had in his life made him very hateful towards Black folk, who were a threat to his job as a young mixed race man raising a family. My grandfather worked in the coal mines of Southern Illinois. My grandparents lived with their 4 children, the eldest being my father, who were pretty wild kids in their own right. They didn't have much. And so they ran around a lot trying to catch fish and stealing vegetables from farms. This was during the early part of the Great Migration. The caste my grandfather was born into struggled with the difficulty of finding work that could provide enough for their families. His adult life began during the time that the first generation of freed slaves was also looking for the independence that they had yet to experience as freed people. In 1916, the journey to the North began for Black people to find work for which they could use their intellectual and artistic abilities. 6 million people made their way from the beatings, lynchings, killings, and slave patrols of the KKK in the South to California, Illinois, Michigan, New York, many stopping in smaller towns to settle down if the white community would let them. A book I have recommended and still recommend is by Isabel Wilkerson, The Warmth of Other Suns, and she's also written Caste. They're excellent books. I highly recommend them. But this history is part of my history. And it is troubling to think about how my grandparents were influenced, not by the color of someone's skin, but by the perceived threat of losing work. And so as my grandfather sat with us on Friday evenings at the table, using language my mother and father cringed at, I listened in confusion. What he said was not right, was it? That someone could be less intelligent or lazy or whatever negative thing he could say just because of the color of their skin? My dad never said a word, but just let my grandfather talk on. Later, my dad would tell me he didn't feel he could say anything without instigating the argument they had had dozens of times. And I feel like that's my story too. That part of the story of silence. Don't rile up the water, someone might get upset. So this was part of the reason I felt so empowered by wearing a Black armband, to show a part of my belief system that Friday so long ago. However, I was not brave enough to wear it home. Martin Luther King said, "Our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter." I was not ready to end my life. At that time, neither did I know the story of the Great Migration and how it became a pathway to the civil rights movement in the 1970s, or even that there was a Harlem Renaissance that is so representative of the migration. They certainly didn't teach that in school, nor did my parents speak about it. But I'm glad to say that over the years, my servant heart has become braver and I hope more responsive to injustices. So I wanted to share this story to say that as we celebrate Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Day, as we remember him and John Lewis and Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Gandhi, We are in a moment of history that is so confusingly frightening that we need to remember more than their names. We need to live their words. I preface this meditation with the fact that I am a white woman who grew up in a primarily white world with a deep-rooted soul that longs for peace, longs for justice. I don't always know the right words that speak to injustice. I don't know all the differences between homeless and houseless. I don't understand the deep-seated sense of violence that some people exhibit. I don't even always feel that I know that God is with us. I tend to doubt the interpretation of scriptures and the stories of old, and I begin to doubt us. As we live through these next few days and weeks, we are not quite sure what history will show as an outcome. Our response to the celebration of the inauguration of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris and the tension of our reactions to the possible violence of this week can lead us into a really deep world of doubt. Sometimes we begin to wonder if God's presence is truly in the midst of the issues of our country. What Brian McLaren says in his new book, Faith After Doubt, is that doubting can be a good thing. Doubt shows that we are alive enough to question the things that are happening in our world, to even question God. We know that in the midst of the terrors and the celebrations that we as a community must stay strong together, even when we have doubts about the strength of our faith. However, doubt is not an attribute of the weak, but rather it demonstrates the mental fortitude of the strong. Doubt demonstrates our ability to critically think, that within our critical thinking, we may discover something about our belief that makes us feel uneasy. Sometimes we can identify what those incongruities are, and sometimes it's just a feeling. Regardless, the willingness to confront those feelings takes great strength and faith. This uneasiness is often why we prefer not to critically think about our faith at all.
If not now, tell me when. If not now, tell me when. We may never see this moment or place in time again. If not now, tell me when.
So, what does our church, our faith community, this community, say about justice and peace? Our youth group, FYI, researched some ancient texts from the Bible about peace, and these are the ancient wisdoms they discovered. From John 14:27, peace I leave with you, my peace I give to you. I do not give to you as the world gives. Do not let your hearts be troubled, and do not let them be afraid. John 16:33, I have said this to you so that in you may have peace. In the world you face persecution, but take courage. I have conquered the world. Proverbs 12:20, deceit is in the mind of those who plan evil, but those who counsel peace have joy. Philippians 4:6, do not worry about anything, but in everything, by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. And Hebrews 12:14, pursue peace with everyone and the holiness without which no one will see the Lord. So Martin Luther King Jr. once said that life's most persistent and urgent question is, what are you doing for others? This is why we carry the gospel into the world. It's why we exercise compassion to those who are stuck in hatred. It's why we seek policies and politicians that advance Sacred values are essential for human thriving. It's why we pursue justice in the systems and structures of our society. As Christians, as people of faith, we believe life is more than just about us. We are our faith. It is imperative that we live our faith out in this community. Platt Park is our patch. It is where we become known for activism and peace, advocates for those who need just a little more strength. We can do that through our music. We can do that through our education. Excuse me. We can do that through peaceful protest. We can do that with letter writing. We can do that by learning the stories of others. Have you ever thought about what the Bible really is? To preface what I'm about to say next, I am a believer in the stories of the Bible. I am a believer in the stories of Jesus. I am a believer in the mystery and love, the mystery of love and grace. But the more I study the Bible and reach into those stories, the more I am convinced that when we see those characters as neighbors or friends or even enemies, we see that those stories are our stories. Different times, different customs, different political arenas, almost. The people are fascinating, but they get us to the essence of the mysteries of the human condition. That's why we tell stories, to see the essence that connects us all. So, what does our church tell us about our faith? Are we on a journey to discover one another's mysterious essence? And are we ready to take the presence of God that we feel, the essence of peace, the peaceful path of protest, the voices of peace into the streets? That's what our faith is telling us to do. We are bound to others in a way that is too devastating to ignore and can be delightful to discover once you appreciate the value that different others bring. We are on this delightful journey to discover how strong, peaceful power can be. I'm ready for this week, for all the potential emotion it will bring. I know I am not alone in my desire to pursue justice. Hear these words of Martin Luther King. Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. I am ready to love. Are we ready for now? Amen. We head into a week of celebration for a lot of us for our new president and vice president. And so as we go into this week, there are going to be a lot of emotions. And I just want to remind you that PJ and I are always here if anybody needs to chat. So as we go into this week, let's hold one another tight. Let's hold the world tight and show the peace that we have deep in our hearts. So go now in the peace of God. Amen.